Hello, and welcome to episode 5 of A Writer's History of Science Fiction, where I interview real-life authors about their personal take on their chosen genre. I'm Alex Howe, and with me today is Annie Geever. Annie is the author of the Undead Age trilogy, which, as you may guess, is a dystopian post-apocalyptic zombie series. And she is currently working on more zombie stories, plus a new young adult series. Annie received a Master of Divinity degree from Star King School for the Ministry, and then served in various administrative-type jobs before fulfilling one of her two lifelong dreams of becoming a full-time writer. The other was becoming a Starfleet officer, to which I definitely relate. Hello, Annie. Thank you for coming on the show.
Hi, Alex. Thanks so much for having me.
So to start off, just tell the listeners about the Undead Age trilogy.
Sure. The Undead Age trilogy is a post-apocalyptic story with zombies. It's set 10 years after the zombie apocalypse because I wanted to play with how the society would develop in the wake of an event like that versus, how does everybody get through it? Everybody does that. And I'm doing that now, the next series. And so, basically it's following, the main character is a woman named Miranda, and she is, become a very different person in the wake of having lived through the zombie apocalypse. She becomes involved in my world. There are cures for the zombie virus, but they are tightly controlled by an elite group that keeps itself in power that way, and she gets drawn into a heist to steal it.
Yeah, I thought that was unusual when I was reading the blurbs for the books, that there's a cure, but it's controlled by this governing council. How did you come about that angle on the zombie trope?
I wanted to have an unequal society, and I was trying to think of ways that you could do that. And my husband, who's my fellow sci-fi geek, we have watched more sci-fi together than I can even tell you about. He was like, well, yeah, okay, so they got to be controlling something. So we settled on a vaccine. We settled on two kinds. One you can take afterward if you get it within a certain period of time, but you have to take it every day because that's a fabulous way to control a population. But to be very choosy about who you'll give it to, because that's another great way to control population, and to be very capricious about availability. So that was kind of how we settled on that. And also, one of the things I love about science fiction in general, and zombies in particular, is, you can use it for social commentary. And that was meant as social commentary about healthcare system in America as well, and, that's one of the things I love about science fiction. That's one of the things I love about, the work of George Romero, who, invented the modern zombie trope and the modern zombie genre. So I wanted to do that too. So it was a mixture of what will work for the story and, what can I do with it? What do I care about that I can maybe try and say something about?
So, were you inspired to write about zombies by George Romero and other works in the genre?
Well, yes. And to write about them at this point in time, the reason that came about is when I decided to start writing, I was super intimidated at the idea of writing an actual book, because I had always wanted to write, but I had always put all this pressure on myself to write the great American novel. And, that's a little high of a bar, especially when you're starting out. So I decided to write in a genre that I don't read. I thought, well, I'll write chick lit. How hard can that be? And I came up with these terrible ideas, one after the other, because I don't read it, and I don't find it particularly interesting. I mean, it's okay at the beach if you find it in the beach house, but it's not my genre of choice. And so I would tell Drew, my husband, my latest bad idea, and he'd be like, that's pretty terrible. So we did this for a couple of weeks, and then one day we were driving home from work, and I was telling him my latest bad idea, and he was agreeing that it was pretty awful, and I was like, too bad it can't have zombies in it. And we just kind of looked at each other, And we were like, oh, that's it. That's what I should be writing about. Like, we hashed out the overarching theme in the world that weekend. And then I got started.
Yeah, writing a genre that you're not familiar with is risky at best.
Yes, risky at best. And the other thing too that maybe makes me laugh about it in retrospect is, writing in any genre is demanding. It's difficult, and so the idea that like I could write this breezy chick lit book just because I thought it wasn't hard because I thought it was a fluffy genre is very embarrassing now. I just look back and I'm like, oh God, I was so arrogant. But yeah, you can't write about something you don't know, and that's not. That doesn't really mean real life experience. It just means, what you know in life. And, I know fantasy, I know sci-fi, I know post-apoc, and I know other kinds of genres too, but, they're not what I'm interested in writing about.
And I did listen to your Origin Stories novella audiobook from your website, and I thought that was pretty good. On the surface, it seems like standard zombie tropes, but I thought it was really innovative in several ways, and I could see you put some thought into it.
Yeah, I wrote that. I kind of built on that in some ways from an abandoned chapter or two that I couldn't use in the book. Like the Emily chapter, I really liked writing that, but I couldn't use it in the book. It was at the wrong time frame. And I for a while there, I was thinking of starting the book with the prologue of what happened to people at the very beginning, and then jumping to 10 years later. So like I'd written the Father Walter chapter, I had written that, ages ago. That's like probably one of my favorite chapters in the entire book. And I did keep that as the first chapter of the book, I think, somehow. I did somehow keep that. I don't remember now, though, but I know it's in the book. But the rest of it was either stuff I had abandoned or stuff that I wrote specifically for that. But I wanted something that I could give away to people for free, whether as a EPUB, as it's only an electronic book. So, as a book. And then since I was getting the audiobooks for the series made, we did that as well. But that was just meant to be something to kind of give people a little glimpse into, and, maybe they would be interested in then going on and reading or listening to the rest of the series. But it's not, it's a very standard what you kind of would expect. People who have read and liked the series really enjoy it because the people, some of them are very, very different. And, it's fun to find out, well, how did it all start when you've already seen where it is now. So it was kind of a combination, magnet for getting people into the books and like Easter egg for all the people who had already read the series.
Going into it cold, I saw it more as a way of establishing the characters and also seeing some of the nuances of the world because, even if it's fairly standard, there are always going to be differences with how the zombies work.
Yeah, exactly. To be perfectly honest, it's not my strongest piece, in my opinion. There are some chapters in it that I really love. I absolutely, positively love the Emily chapter. And I really like the Miranda chapter because Miranda was somebody who was going to get you killed at the beginning. I mean, she was a complete liability. But, when people meet her in the book, she's absolutely the person you want around. So, so that was, again, for people who may read that first and then get to the book and they're like, whoa, what happened to her? Because she is totally different. Or just for fans to go back and see like, whoa, I can't believe she started out that way. But it is a fairly standard thing. It does pull people into the world a little bit. But see, I'm so glad I didn't write the actual series that way because see, I like being dropped into a world and finding out as you read. That is my favorite kind of book. I don't like books where people explain a lot at the beginning. That's really not the kind of, that's not how I want to discover a world. So, as far as the series goes, I started the series in the right place. I wanted the series to be that kind of book where you get dropped in and you find out little things in dribs and drabs. You find it out early enough, that you can understand the world, but you don't get this big info dump that's like you can't even remember it all.
Yeah, I completely agree. I've talked about that before on the podcast. Books that just throw you in the deep end when it's done well is some of the best literature out there. And
Hmm.
I've said David Brin's Existence is, for me, the gold standard for that.
Hmm. Hmm. I have really enjoyed, like, I don't know if you've read any Karl Schroeder, the Son of Sun, the Candace trilogy, Son of Suns, and it's kind of a slight mashup of sci-fi and fantasy, but he created this absolutely interesting, very unique world, and you know, and this world where like people have gone out into space, but they've created these enclosed environments where they can live, but they've got airships. I guess it's maybe a little steampunk. They've got airships, but there's no gravity in them, so they've got to create their own gravity, and they have to do it with these little towns. And like, it was really interesting, but he just started you off with a battle between two of these ships, and you didn't even know where they were. And I really enjoyed that a lot. I think he does that well. And also, I'm gonna mangle his name, but the guy who wrote the China Girl, Paolo Bacigalupi,
Wind
I
Up Girl.
think. Well, a Wind Up Girl. Thank you. Yeah, the Wind Up Girl and the Water Knife and the Drowned Cities. I also think he does that really well.
I didn't care for the Wind Up Girl, but it wasn't because of the style. It was because nobody used solar power, and it didn't make sense.
Oh, it annoyed you. It is funny when people they don't have those things that you would expect that are like no-brainers. So see, I didn't even notice that when I was reading it.
Yeah, I mean, he said in an interview that it was an artistic choice to not use much renewable energy because it wasn't actually meant to be hard sci-fi. It was meant to be more
Hmm.
artistic.
Hmm. Hmm. I can see that, and honestly, I could totally see that being the case because humanity is doing such a bad job right now, and has for the last 50 years done such a bad job with adopting anything that is going to make a serious impact in saving the planet with climate change that I could absolutely see having this complete disaster and people still not doing it, still sticking with what they know, which doesn't work.
I'm optimistic on solar, and I've been telling my friends that for the past 10 years.
Hmm. Oh, I do too, but I'm very pessimistic about you. I think humanity's already failed, and I think the planet is doomed. Long term, I do. I think we've blown it, and we're going to kill ourselves and every other living being on this planet. The planet's going to truck along, and something will maybe come along that'll be able to do it. But I'm very pessimistic about humanity's ability to adapt because so far what I've seen in my life is a complete lack of adaptability because there's too much money to be made with the way it is with the status quo. But that's just me. Other people are more optimistic, and it's really good to have optimists.
Okay. Deep discussions in this episode. So, looking at your background, you started with a Master of Divinity degree. What was your path going from that to being a writer, especially a science fiction writer?
A lot of ministers I know who like sci-fi, first off, or people I went to school with. I went to seminary when I was started in my mid 20s. I was like 26, and I was really just trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. And I went to a Unitarian church, which I loved because they're totally progressive lefties. You've got people who are anything from atheists to people who are pretty hardcore religious practice of one tradition or another. They don't have a creed. They really think you have to, one of their first tenets is everyone has to undertake their own responsible search for, truth and meaning, kind of thing. So it's comes out of the Enlightenment in a more progressive tradition. So I was trying to figure out what to do, and, it kind of got back to my whole question about people, about humanity, which is, are they good or bad? Well, as I've grown and gotten older, I've settled it. People are people, and they do a wide range of things, and everybody has the ability to range from, one end to the other, depending on life experience, circumstance, all that kind of stuff. And honestly, I think that's what a lot of sci-fi is about. It's about how do people adapt and evolve. I mean, pretty much all good literature, how do people deal with where they're at? Why do they make the choices they do? Do they adapt and evolve, or do they not and then, go by the wayside? So for me, it makes absolute sense. There's no dichotomy in terms of, you know, believing in science and reality and being interested in theological questions. They kind of are of a piece.
I can see that. So, does your background in theology influence your writing?
I didn't think it did, but I think it does, because, like when I wrote the first book, the bad guys are this council who really are very ruthless and cutthroat and all about keeping themselves in power, and the counterweight was this Jesuit university. Well, I picked them because I was setting my story in the San Jose, Santa Clara area where I was living at the time. And I was looking at, well, what are available? What are the building blocks? And I worked at Santa Clara University, and I'm very familiar with the Catholic tradition, having been raised Irish Catholic and having several aunts who are nuns. And I'm very much on the progressive social justice side. That's where my family landed. So, I mean, it was just obvious. Like, if I've got this bad guy, who are going to be the counterweight? Well, they'd be the counterweight. Clearly, they would be the counterweight. I mean, I remember when I was working there at the time, there was a lot of, there was a lot of excitement that maybe the Dreamers Act would come to fruition, and the priests all get paid a salary. They don't keep it, but they all get paid a salary, but they decide what to do with it. And, they're getting paid market rate salaries for professors. Well, they decided they were going to start donating all their salaries to paying the tuition for undocumented students, because they can't apply for anything. And I remember the college Republicans were very upset about it. And I saw one of the priests, and in the interview, Michael had said, well, it's our damn money. It's our money. We can do whatever the hell we want with it. And I saw him. I said, oh, Michael, you're upsetting the college Republicans. You're doing a good job. But, so, and that's an example of the kind of thing that, the conscious effort they make to do work to uplift people who aren't having the same kind of tradition. So anyway, long story short, I didn't think it did, but people really were like, when I read the early reviews, they're like, oh yeah, it explores religion and the good and the bad and this, that, and the other. And, I wasn't coming at it from that viewpoint consciously at all. I was just thinking about, what can I do to make a good story? That is literally all I was doing. But religion ended up playing kind of a big part in this story, not just from the architecture of the world, but also from some of the main characters. So and it's kind of, it's not such a thing in this next series, but it will be in this dystopian young adult series I'm developing, very much so. So yeah, I mean, it's fun to play with, religion. It's just so, people go from like pretty rational to completely whacked out when it comes to religion, so there's a lot of stuff you can play with when you start pulling in religious themes, even if it's very subtle.
I mean, that's the way to do it. What makes a good story?
Mm-hmm.
And even if you do want to explore religion or some other theme, you need to start with what makes a good story.
Yes, you do. And that's a hard thing to learn as a writer, because you start with the second book in the series is set in Seattle. And my first thought was, they could go to Powell's, which is like this amazing independent bookstore. It takes up a city block, it's mostly used books, And I wrote this whole 2 chapters about them going to Powell's, and, there was a reason, and this, that, and the other. And every single person who read it was like, doesn't move the story first, cut it. And you have to realize, like, okay, yeah, that's a cool idea. That would appeal to me. I would try to go to Powell's, but it's not making a good story. So that's something you definitely have to learn. I mean, all those ideas are great because they do help you flesh out the world, but you always have to keep in mind, like, what's going to make the story interesting, what's going to keep the story moving forward, because you can have all the great ideas in the world, but if you don't have a story, if the story doesn't hold together, and you can, like movies, you can have the best cast in the world, you could have everybody who's won every Academy Award in the history of film, if they don't have a good script, it doesn't matter, you can't do anything with it.
Now, you're a lifelong sci-fi fan.
Absolutely.
Who or what in sci-fi is your biggest inspiration in your writing?
You know, you wouldn't know it from what I've written so far, but Star Trek definitely is one. You know, when I was a kid, you know, Star Trek had gone into syndication. And, you know, when my mother was pregnant with my little brother, there was a very hardcore Kirk faction when we were kicking around names. He was named Justin. Kirk didn't figure into it. But Star Trek definitely was a really big one. I'm trying to think of some of the early sci-fi authors I read because, you know, my older brothers were really into science fiction. And so while the larger family was definitely into Star Trek, my brothers were like super into sci-fi, into like monster movies and stuff like that, and like old monster movies. Yeah, I'm having trouble thinking like what was the early sci-fi I used to read. Yeah, Star Trek's probably the biggest influence in terms of me being someone who wanted to explore and, you know, go to different places and then to see all the things that are possible. So, and I'm the only person on the planet who hasn't read A Wrinkle in Time, so it wasn't a wrinkle.
Star Trek is definitely how I got started. Then stylistically, Arthur Clarke was the big one, and then later David Brin, of course.
Yeah, I can't believe I'm blanking so hard on some of the early sci-fi that I read. I think I probably really started reading it when I was a teenager, but I was still pretty heavily into fantasy then. But like as far as some of my favorite sci-fi authors, like I love Richard K. Morgan. You know, like when I read 13, I was like, this is the best sci-fi book I've read in the last 10 years. You know, I just thought it was fantastic. I remember reading, I think it's Chris Moriarty. He wrote Spin State when that was in my early 20s. And that was like super interesting. You know, I mentioned Karl Schroeder. I love Anne Leckie. I thought,
yes.
You know, now it's funny, I haven't finished that series. The second book I got bogged down in the second book and I was like, I just couldn't finish it. But my husband's like, go back, read it again. He said the third book is like fantastic. But like the whole idea of, you know, the consciousness of a spaceship somehow getting put into a person. I mean, that just blew my mind. So yeah, there's just so many great people and they have such better ideas than I have had. You know, you read something and you're like, oh, what a great idea. I wish it had been my idea. But, you know, maybe someday I'll have an idea and somebody will be like, because I've got a couple straight sci-fi and time travel sci-fi stories that I want to write, you know, and my little brother, he has these crazy dreams and he's a musician. So he's used to waking up in the middle of the night and like recording things. And so when he wakes up from these things, he records them and then he sends me them. And I'm like, oh, oh, that's fabulous. So, you know, that's definitely something I can work with.
With regard to writing style, on your website, you say that every great story is at its core a love story, which is not the same as a romance. What do you mean by that?
I'm blanking on the name. The spaceship consciousness one.
Ancillary Justice.
Ancillary Justice. That's a love story. That's not a romance. The spaceship really loved the commander. And everything she's doing since, you know, I'm not what I used to be. Everything she's doing since she got her consciousness got ripped from that, it's to avenge that wrong against this person that she loved. Like one of my favorite examples is the movie A History of Violence with Viggo Mortensen. I don't know if you're familiar with the film, but it's this guy who's living in small town America. He's got a wife, he's got kids. It's like really, you know, just living the American dream. it turns out that he's very much not who he used to be. His past catches up with him, and he's suddenly thrust in, and he and his family are thrust into this situation that, like, he may have anticipated, but none of them did. And it's, a history of violence. It's not, it's not like violent for violence's sake, but, it's kind of about how, people who are living and dying by the sword, and they get out and then it catches up with them, kind of thing. And you have to deal with that. So this is not a film that anybody going in would think, oh, this is a romance. I mean, it starts with like a quadruple homicide. And so when my husband and I sat down, he said, oh, this is a romance. And I laughed at him. But the very end of that film, and I won't say what it is because I hate people who give away films or books. That spoiler people make me absolutely crazy. But at the absolute very last scene in that film, something happens, and it's like 2 seconds long. And I just looked at my husband and I was like, holy crap, this was totally a love story. So, romances are about, the magic of falling in love and the magic of finding that person and that one. And that's not what a love story is. A love story, because a love story isn't necessarily about romantic love. A love story can be about love of a kid or a country or an idea. And love can give life a higher purpose, and people's motivations and actions a higher purpose than just, the immediate wants and needs. So, I think, it can also not. So that's the difference between a love story and a romance. I don't read romance. I mean, when I was a teenage girl, I went through a pretty hardcore bodice ripper phase, but I don't read romance. I don't find romance particularly compelling. But, if a story doesn't have some kind of, but I do find stories that have some kind of love interest in them more compelling and more interesting. Like even Nick Cole, who he's written the books about the Space Marines. He's got this whole series, and it's really hardcore, sci-fi, and it's not about romance. But even the hard-bitten captain in that one, he falls in love with this alien, So it's or just like, I don't know if you've read Fallen Dragon by Peter K. Hamilton. That's another fantastic science fiction. It's a standalone. It's really, really well done. And, the ultimate motivation, again, they call themselves like Marines. They're really mercenaries and pirates, companies give the money to start colonies, and then later on they come back for their asset realization, which is they basically come back to the planet and completely plunder it to get their investment back. It's a really great story, but even that one, ultimately the ultimate motivation is love. So and if you haven't read it, you really ought to read it. I'm not the biggest Peter K. Hamilton fan. I couldn't believe how bad the reality dysfunction was. And I was afraid to go back and read Fallen Dragon because I was like, oh my God, did I like it then? Because I just didn't know better. But I was happy to find out that it was later in his career and he had indeed gotten a lot better. But so lots of films and books that I make a big distinction between love and romance, because as a genre, romance is not something I find particularly compelling, but I do like a good love story.
I hadn't thought about it that way, but I can definitely see it. And I'm reminded, talking about books that throw you in the deep end, Stand on Zanzibar by John Brunner.
Mm-hmm. And I have not read that, so I'm not familiar with that.
That's one of the earliest examples of this throw you in the deep end style. And it's a story about overpopulation and the breakdown of society. But, and this is another one where you get to the very end, and I won't spoil it, but you realize that it was a love story.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, even in a very weird way, like Asimov's Robot series can be about that. because like I love Lige Bailey, and I love, that he's basically got these detective novels in space in the future. Yeah, but even that in some strange ways can be, even with just the principles of the robots and the rules of that rule robots. But anyway, slight digression. But I'll check out Brenner now.
Okay.
I love learning about new sci-fi because it doesn't matter how long you've been reading it and how much you think you know about it. There's always somebody who knows something different.
So, how did you get your start as an author?
I always wrote. When I was a kid, I wrote stories all the time. I mean, it's funny. I found one recently, and it was. I can see that I wrote it after seeing Star Wars in some ways, freedom fighters and whatnot. But like, I had people who had jetpacks, and they had what I called light maps, where these little pieces of glass that would trace their progress when they were going places. So I always wrote stories as a kid. Because I was a very voracious reader. Some kids went out and played, and sure, I did that, but I also would read, all the time. I mean, it wasn't uncommon for me to read a book a day in the summertime when I was a kid. And as I got older, I kind of lost my confidence around fiction, and was I any good at it? And so I started writing more creative nonfiction in terms of like articles and, stories about opinions, pieces, and that kind of stuff. But I still wanted to write fiction. I just kind of got chicken about it. And then, finally I got to a point in my life where I was like, okay, I'm either going to do this or I'm not. And so I decided to do it.
And how did, you're an indie author, so is that self-published?
Yes.
And how did you make that decision, and how did you actually get published and go through the whole process?
Well, when I first finished the book, I thought, you know what, okay, I've finished the book. I might as well, do the queries and whatnot. But the more I did them and the more I tried to sell my book, the more I realized that it was just a roadblock for me, and I also found out that like I didn't need that external validation. I didn't need somebody to tell me that my book was worth publishing. And I didn't want to wait, because you spend however much time it takes to get an agent. So that it typically takes a couple of years. So you take a couple of years, you find an agent, you need to get them to say yes. Then they've got to shop it around for however long that takes to try and find someone who will say yes. And then you've got to wait another year to 18 months for the book to ever show up. So, and I just wasn't willing to do that. I didn't need anybody to tell me my book was good enough. I knew the book was good. Are there things I would do differently in that first book now? Yes, I'm a better writer now. Third book, I think it was clearly the best of the second book's better than the first, and the third book was definitely the best of the series. But, the first book is still a damn good book. And so I didn't want to wait. And also, traditional publishing people think it offers a lot of things it used to offer, and it doesn't. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get any marketing support. It doesn't mean you're going to get publicity support. It doesn't mean you're going to get a good royalty. It does mean you can only do a book a year, because that's their model. And the traditional publishing model is based on churn of new stuff. You lose so much control. That's the other thing. I'm a complete control freak, and I really wanted to keep control of my creative assets, and like I found out since, one of the things I've learned from the indie community is that, like, you're not going to get your first 3 to 6, 8 books. You're just finding your readers, and you're establishing an audience. And every once in a while you get somebody who writes something that just blows up and, is a sensation. And like people, like I've heard someone once say something about Hugh Howey. Wow, like he just came out of nowhere. It's like, no, the guy had his books up free for years, and by the time anybody, by the time the mainstream traditional press took any notice, he had like 5 books out, so it was easy to think, oh, he came out of nowhere, but he had been building that. But like when you are a traditional author, you can't really publicize your own books. So, one of the ways that indie authors, you make your money is you're always trying to introduce people to your series, into your writing, into your characters. And so you're always promoting your earlier stuff. You're always promoting that back catalog. You can't do that when you are an indie author. You have no insight into the data, and you can take the time to build an audience and to find the niche. Like I know an author who she's doing very well now. It was her 9th book before she really hit the right genre and started to make enough money to support herself. And that just, traditional publishing has kind of gone the way of Hollywood in the blockbuster mentality, where, you have to have something really big and worth their while to make their further investment in your career worth it. Nobody gets to start out like Stephen King did. Stephen King didn't start off as a blockbuster, but they very slowly nurtured his career thinking, that he could do that. They don't do that anymore. And if you don't produce results really quickly, you very quickly become somebody who's making less and less money traditionally. So part of it was just wanting to be able to. So part of it was that I was ready and I didn't want to wait. But I didn't need the external validation. That was probably the biggest thing. Some people really need it. And if they need it, and there's nothing wrong with that, if they need it, then they should take a different route. And that's not to say that like all independent books are good. Some of them really are terrible. And their traditional books can be terrible too, and the gatekeeping doesn't necessarily mean it's better, but you do find good stuff in wherever you're looking, whether it's an independent author or a traditionally published author. There's good stuff there and there's bad stuff in both places. It's just a matter of finding what you like and finding what's worth your time.
Yeah, I'm in that place right now where I'm kind of on the fence about traditional publishing versus self-publishing. And then also the web serial format really appeals to me, so that's also something I can consider.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so funny too, because like people think of like these classics like Dickens as like, oh, these great literary works. They were very popular fiction published serially. And, serial fiction really got to be very looked down on for years, but there's a huge audience of people who like to write that way or like to read that way, and who don't want to have to always be waiting, having these gaps between when they get their story, and there's people who like to write that way, who like that, the smaller chunks of a larger story, that really works for them. That's what makes it possible for them to write, so when things get super duper established, they get established around some kind of principle, and which means other things always get shut out, and you miss out on certain things. So that's one of the things I like about the whole self-publishing side is you've got a lot more options in terms of what you want to pursue. You've also got like a ton more work. Because you've got to do all the business stuff on your side. But I know traditionally published authors who are doing a lot of the same business side stuff that I'm doing. So, except that they have no control over the advertising, they have no insight into the economics of it, and so they're kind of like doing the worst of both, in my opinion. But there are people who definitely would disagree with that. I'm certainly not the be all end all final authority.
And right now, you're working on another Undead Age trilogy and a post-apocalyptic young adult series about a flu pandemic. And you started that last year. Was that inspired by COVID?
No, actually, I started that at the end of 2019 because I found this like summer writing workshop that looked really appealing to me, like six weeks long. I don't know what I was thinking. I didn't have the money to do it. I didn't know at the time, but what they did was short stories, because you have to have all the elements in a short story that you have in a novel. And, if you're doing a 6-week workshop and you're writing short stories, you can work on all those elements in something that, doesn't take a long time to read. So I decided I was going to pull together a story to apply to that. And I had written a story for an anthology of zombie stories, but they were 100-word stories. They had to be exactly 100 words long. And the story I had written, I thought, would be easily adaptable to something else. It didn't have to be zombies. And so as I wrote that story, I started that story in like December of 2019. And I'm writing that story, and January rolls around, and you kind of hear about COVID, and, it's far away. It didn't seem like a big deal. And so anyway, I'm writing this story, and I'm finished. I'm like, working on like the third go round in March, and COVID's blowing up. And I was like, this is really kind of creepy, so it was not inspired by COVID, but the timing was certainly very strange.
And then you're also working on an urban fantasy series?
Yeah, right now I'm just like right now I'm working on another Undead Age series, different time, different characters, but in the same universe. And part of the reason I'm doing that is because advice I've been given by authors who have been doing this a lot longer than I am is you don't jump genres too fast, because you found people who like what you're writing. So you really should, do a bit more there to kind of solidify the following you found so far. And, I like zombies. I mean, I was so tired of zombies by the time I finished that first book. I was never even going to write anything else. I was just going to leave it be a standalone. I was never going to write about zombies again. Obviously, I changed my mind. But, yeah, the urban fantasy and the YA, right now, it's just like ideas and, pre-writing kind of stuff. I decided I'm going to start alternating between, writing the current Undead Age series I'm writing and writing the YA. I'm going to flip back and forth every week and see how that goes. See if that's something that works for me. But yeah, I'm working on an urban fantasy series that I want to set in Pittsburgh, because Charles DeLint is like the gold standard for urban fantasy, in my opinion. He invented the genre, and B, he's just fantastic. He's just really makes these really interesting, has created a very interesting world. And what he's done is he has made this fictional city that kind of, that's the center of everything he writes about. And he writes short stories set in that city with recurring characters. He writes novels of people who are somehow connected to that world. And I want to do something like that. I want to be able to have this larger world to draw on and different characters that I can follow, and write the standalone stories, but in a world that, the readers who are familiar with it will immediately know like what's going on and what this is about. And you can introduce new things too. So yeah, so I'm kind of, I'm kicking that around. I finally figured out what the main character for the first book's going to be. So that took a long time.
And how do you manage multiple projects like that?
Sometimes really badly.
I know the feeling.
Yeah, it just, I've never decided to flip back and forth what I'm writing. I've always been, I'm writing this and I'm going to stick with it. So we're going to see how this, spending 1 week on the one and 1 week on the other is going to go. I know people who write that way and they're like, oh, it makes it so much better. I really enjoy coming back. And I don't know that's going to work with me or not. But, I try to, whatever I'm working on, actively writing, I want to always get into that and be doing something and do some writing on that. But then, there's, I get the idea. I'm always thinking about the other stuff, and I'll have an idea, and I'm always making recordings on my phone so I don't forget it. And, and like right now, I've been goofing around with covers for the YA books, which are it's completely ridiculous because they're not even written. And I've been like, oh, that would be kind of cool. So sometimes I don't approach it in a very linear manner, but I do try to always be in the current work that I'm writing, and I always do try to. I mean, I treat it like a job. It's my job. I go to work. I write, for a particular period of time in the day. I like to try and hit a word count goal. I don't always, but I always try to hit that 3,000 words a day. And then, I have other time that I'll think about that. And like, I'll be doing it at night, I'll be at home. My husband teases me that I've become a total workaholic since I started working for myself but I'm like, oh, well, yeah, but like I have the idea, or if I don't do it, no one else will. So sometimes very methodically, and other times I'm like a little flea jumping from dog to dog.
So what is your writing process?
Well, like I said, I like to get to a place. I like to have a particular place to write. I did not realize until COVID happened how much I liked going out to coffee shops and just writing, because you can be out among the world, because I'm an extrovert. So like, COVID has been no friend of, not that COVID is a friend of anybody, but like, my husband's an introvert. He didn't find the lack of interaction with people nearly as challenging as I did. It took him till this past March to be like, where I was like that 3 weeks in. So I used to go out a lot, at least a couple of times a week. But my writing process is, I'm an outliner. I really like to have some bones to work with, partially because that just is how my mind works, partially because I had the very first part of my first book really clear in my mind, and I had the end clear, but I didn't have the middle clear. It was always like, and then this will happen and they'll do that. Well, then I got to that and I didn't know what to do. And like, I had to figure it out as I was writing the book, and it took 6 months. It took a really long time for me to figure that out, because I had nothing to do. I was starting from scratch again. And if I had just outlined it, I would have had a better idea. And, one thing I find that is a common misconception about people who outline versus people who, pantsers, they just fly by the seat of their pants. I find that people who don't outline tend to think that people who do outline are slaves to the outline, which isn't true. It's just the skeleton, and you have an idea and it changes. And, what I do is, if I was going to kill Alex in chapter 5, and then I decided in chapter 8 that no, actually I need Alex, and Alex is an interesting character, I just start writing from chapter 8 on as if he had not been dead those 3 chapters. And I make a note, and it's like, Alex is alive, get him in those 3 chapters, or this happened or that happened, or I want to change this. And so I just make notes as I go along and change, and I'll revise the outline because I do like to refer to them. But, that's one thing that was really helpful to learn, was that, have the idea, write it down, just keep going as if it had always been that way, and fix it on the rewrite. So, but I find that the more methodical I am about writing, in terms of spending the time doing it every day, not every day, I take the weekends off. I don't write on the weekends unless I'm absolutely on fire with an idea. Is something that keeps me generating ideas, because it's like it's funny. One of the best books I've read about writing was a book about academic writing. It was when I worked at the university, because I worked in the faculty development department, so we supported faculty scholarship and research and all that stuff. And it's a book called How to Write a Lot. And they did an experiment, this professor who wrote this book, where they had, one group had to write every day. They had a set writing time, and any day and one group just wrote as ideas occurred to them. And the way they enforced you have to write every day is, every day you didn't write, you had to make a donation to a cause you hated as an incentive to do it. And what they found is that the people who wrote every day had more ideas, and I mean massively more ideas, by like a factor of 10. They had more ideas, they had better ideas. And obviously, because they're writing every day, they got a whole lot more written. And I have found that to be very true, when I'm not, because your brain's always working on it, even if you're not thinking about it per se. So I find, but I'm not a write every day person. I need time off to regenerate and to to not be thinking about writing and to, like spend with my pets and spend with my family and see my friends, But I do find that being consistent is absolutely the best thing I've found to keep me moving forward. That and, having a structure. So I like to have steps to follow. So outlines really work for me.
Yeah, I do outline, and my outlines more than 3 to 5 chapters out are always very much subject to change.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, because it's funny. And sometimes in my outlines, what I have outlined as one chapter actually is like 4, because I start to write it and I realize like I've got so much in that plot point that there's no way it could be a chapter. You have to break it up, So I very much relate to that.
Yeah, I feel like I've gotten the rhythm down better now, but I was definitely like that for a while.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, I find, like a lot of things, it helps to be flexible, even with like I was talking about, like trying to be consistent about my writing. There are days when I can write the 3,000 words a day, no problem. There are days when it's a lot of work and I'm pulling teeth and I am like, I am forcing myself to stay in that chair to get those words. And then there are days when I write 268 words because it's just not happening. And, and realizing that like, okay, you're going to have those days. Why don't you just work on something else? Why don't you work on, developing this other concept or working on your newsletter or, starting to recognize and be less rigid about how I pursue things, I found to be very helpful.
And as an outliner, this is somewhat related. Do you ever have to deal with world builder syndrome?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Because you think, I mean, it's just like, the same thing with the plot, you run into something and you're like, oh, I need to change it. And it gets real tempting to go back and like keep tweaking your world a lot. But again, I kind of try to apply that. But see, I do a lot of what I call pre-writing and other people call pre-writing is like, I will think about something for a really long time. Like these other projects that I'm not currently writing, I have been thinking about them for a solid 3 years. And I've been making notes and I've been making decisions and I've been having ideas and I've been looking into things that people say, oh, I think this will be helpful for the story you're writing. So by the time I start writing it, I usually have a pretty good idea of what I want the world to look like. But, again, that's always subject to some kind of change if there's a new idea or there's, sometimes the plot point will change the world. Sometimes you have an idea for the world, which then goes and changes the plot to a degree. So, yeah, I mean, the whole thing, it's a very fluid process in terms of ideas and what you decide to use or not use. And sometimes you just have the best idea in the world, but, you'd have to rewrite the whole book. And it's just like, well, I'm not doing that. I've started, I'll stick with this. Maybe I'll do that later. So, yeah, sometimes it's really about, do I really want to do that work? And sometimes you do, and sometimes you want to save it for later because you just don't want to trash a whole book and start again. I've never had that happen yet. Might happen, but so far, no.
All right. Getting to be time to wrap it up. There are 3 questions I ask everybody. First one is, what do you consider to be the first science fiction novel?
First science fiction novel? Boy, maybe Frankenstein.
That's a pretty common answer.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me. What about you? What do you consider the first?
I go with Frankenstein.
Okay, yeah, that's that. I mean, it ticks a lot of boxes, and it establishes that kind of tinkering with what reality is and can be, which I think is a really fundamental idea of sci-fi is, what constitutes reality and where do I think things now could end up in the future. Like, how could we go from here? So, yeah. Thanks.
Second question is, do you have any must-reads in sci-fi that people might not have heard of?
Well, people have probably heard of Richard K. Morgan, and now that Netflix is out, everybody's heard of the Altered Carbon series. But I would definitely say those. I would definitely recommend Fallen Dragon by Hamilton and the Candace series, The Son of Suns. That's a really interesting series that I find not a lot of people have read. It's really quite good.
Okay.
What do you always suggest?
Well, certainly David Brin's Existence. He's a big name author, but that's maybe not his most famous one. Honestly, I haven't thought a lot more about this question. If you gave me a particular subgenre, I could definitely.
Question number 3.
Question number 3. What advice do you have for aspiring writers?
Don't expect to be good at the beginning. And understand that a lot of what you write in that first draft is you fleshing out the world, in your head. Like, I have slaved over chapters that on second read, that was just me figuring things out, and getting it straight in my head. And 90% of it never makes it into the book because it's boring. So, just expect that you aren't necessarily gonna be that good at the beginning. I always suggest getting a writing group with people who you think are better writers than you, because that I joined a writing group right around the time I decided to start writing. A friend of mine was organizing one. I learned a lot. I realized I had absolutely no way there are certain things about writing I just didn't know, and was taught through that group. And also, another thing that's really common with new writers is to be super protective of your ideas and to be unwilling to listen to suggestions from other people. Like, when I was writing the first book, everything my husband would suggest, almost, if it was changing the story, I would be like, oh, no, well, that won't work because of X, Y, and Z. And then about 3 days later, I'd be like, you know what? You're actually onto something, and I'm going to check it out. And like, now I'm much more open to ideas, but it's understandable because you're new and you're just starting. You're really invested in it, and you're very protective of this thing you're creating. But get other writers to help you. Get a writing group. Don't expect to write a great book that first draft. You may have a great story, but it's not going to be in the first draft. And to try to back off that protective instinct that keeps you from listening to other ideas. But that's a lot, and some of that you just get as you go.
Mm-hmm. All right, Annie, thanks again for coming on. It's been great talking to you. And where can the listeners find your books?
I am published wide, so they can find me on any platform like Barnes & Noble, Amazon, Kobo, Apple Books. I'm missing somebody, but those are the biggies. You can find me on my website, www.amgeever, like geese, geever.com. And then I'm also on Facebook and Instagram.
All right.
Thanks so much. I really enjoyed this.
Yeah, it's been fun. This has been a writer's history of science fiction. This podcast is available wherever you're listening to it now. You should know the drill by this point. I'm on YouTube at Science Meets Fiction, on Twitter at SciMeetsFiction, and my own website is sciencemeetsfiction.com. In the next episode, we finish up our Time trilogy with a look at alternate history. Thanks for listening.